Welcome to the 8th grade Social Studies STAAR Test Prep Session 7-Minute Mastery Series. This is Cram Session Part 2. If you haven't watched Cram Session Part 1, stop right now, go back and watch Cram Session Part 1. This is Part 2. So as you know, if you've already seen the first one, this is not a 7-minute video. This is much longer because this is a comprehensive video covering all of the material on the second half of the 7-Minute Mastery Series videos. This should be, or will be, probably one of the last videos you watch before you take your STAAR test. There's going to be a lot of information here. Press pause if you need to. Come back and watch some more. Take notes. Rewatch. Whatever you need to do. Here we go. Let's get started. Indian Removal Act of 1830 was signed by President Andrew Jackson, and this essentially gave the federal government the legal right to remove all the Native Americans from the southeast, mostly in the Florida, Georgia area, but there's some other areas as well, and move them to away from their native lands to the Oklahoma Territory. This was done in pursuit of taking this Indian land so that they could use it for their own U.S. State gains for natural resources or whatever. This led to the Trail of Tears. The march of these Indians across this land was what later became known as the Trail of Tears because it was a journey these Native Americans had to take. They were led by military forces from their homelands to these reservations across the Mississippi River over there in Oklahoma. Many of them died and starved and froze along the way as they crossed mountain ranges and whatnot. And it was a terrible atrocity in American history. So the way you need to know, Indian Removal Act led to the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson put it into place. It was Native Americans being forced off their native lands in the southeast, moved to Oklahoma Territory. Okay, Worcester versus Georgia. The Supreme Court said that Georgia and any state had no right to intervene with Indian lands. It's a really complex court case, and there's a lot of details here, but that's essentially what you need to know. But then President Andrew Jackson came along and basically said, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, we're going to do what we want to the Native Americans. So it was interesting to see the push and pull of the judicial system with the executive branch here. The Dawes Act of 1887, another terrible act against Indians. This is a few years after the Civil War. It allowed the president to survey Indian land and divide and allot this land to different individual Indians apart from the tribe as a whole. This was intended to assimilate Indians. The word assimilate just means make like the people around you. So it was intended to make the Native Americans less like Native Americans and more like the modern Americans that were there at the time. So this was essentially to make them like the whites in every way they could. Really, what you need to know about the Dawes Act is it was an attempt to separate and segregate the Indians away from their tribal community and force them to be individuals and live like the other white people around them. So again, another atrocity to the Native Americans. Generally speaking, I tell my students, if you see anything on a STAAR test about Native Americans and you don't know the answer, choose the thing that seems like it's the worst possible thing, and you're going to be right. Industrialization. Beginning in the late 1700s, mills and factories began to spring up throughout the northern states. Originally, these ideas were brought over from Great Britain. The northern states were a good place for industry because they had fast-flowing rivers, which were good for mills. You see these big circular wheels up here. Those are the essential component of these mills. And these fast-flowing rivers were also good for transportation of products and goods. Because they had fewer large farms than the South, the northern states were just an ideal place because of conditions for industry. Places like New York and New Jersey, among others, were soon very widely known for their industry. Industrialization continued here. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, it greatly increased the speed at which seeds were removed from the cotton plants, thus increasing the demand for slaves to pick more cotton. You see the machine up here. You see some slaves dumping bags of cotton freshly picked or bales of cotton not bales, but baskets and bags of cotton picked from the fields, dumping it into this machine, and there's a man cranking the handle there, and it spins this. It's called cotton gin because it's short for engine. They would spin that wheel and crank it, and out the other side would come cotton that's ready to be shipped to the textile mills and actually be made into cloth. So it really increased the speed at which they could produce the cotton, so now they wanted more slaves to pick the cotton. This also increased cotton mills and textile mills in the northern states, because now these northern states were getting more cotton. They could produce more cloth, and with the intake of raw cotton, they could spin out more textiles. Textiles is just another word for woven fabric or cloth. With large groups of migrants entering the country, labor was cheap in the north, and slavery was obviously cheap in the south, and this promoted immense growth of U.S. economy. Speaking of U.S. economy, let's talk about the one war that seems like all the questions on the STAAR test always focus on this outcome. The British eventually invaded the United States, getting as far as Washington, D.C., and burning the White House during this war, but there's not a lot of global or even domestic change here, because historically the war had very little political consequence. There was no lands interchange, no revolution or independence gained, no countries formed because of the War of 1812. What we do see on the test about it generally is one of the most significant consequences of the war was the growth of U.S. industry. And it's kind of ironic, but here's what happened. Prior to the war, almost all manufactured goods came from England. We didn't have much industry in our country, and so anything that had to be manufactured in a mill or factory, we bought from the English. Well, during the war with the British, they stopped trading these goods and selling these goods to us. So the United States was then forced, if they wanted to purchase or have these products, they were forced to start industrializing themselves. So because of the war, because we were forced to and unable to buy merchandise from the British, the United States began to have more and more industries and factories to build and produce these goods and products that we used to get from the British. So places like Lowell Mills, Massachusetts, they became famous for their massive industrial locations and lots of mills, and before unheard of quantities of goods that were produced here. All right, let's talk about Andrew Jackson. He narrowly lost the election of 1824, and actually he won the popular vote, but there was some backhanded stuff going on in Congress. He did not become president until he ran again in 1828. The reason he won in 1828 was mostly because voting restrictions on quote-unquote common people were greatly reduced, meaning more common, normal, less rich people were now able to vote. And considering that Andrew Jackson was considered a common man, these other common men voted for him. He was more like themselves. He was a very uncommon common man, but the common man term we're just using to say he wasn't born rich, he wasn't born wealthy and of noble, prestigious birth. His fathers weren't founding fathers. He was really the first common man voted into presidency. He actually gained his fame during the War of 1812. Again, the war that really didn't change anything in the country other than changing industry. He won that because he gained fame in that because he won a hard-fought battle at the Battle of New Orleans and became famous for it. So when he entered presidency, he was really the first common man. The thing is you see that the image at the top right, kind of a comedy mocking him. He really kind of reigned in his office kind of like a king, in that he really didn't let anybody else influence his decision, or it didn't seem that he did. During the 1830s, there was much unrest around the high-ranking officials who gained position due to political favoritism. So because of him and his office, it looked like a lot of the people in his cabinets and in upper positions in politics seemed like they might have gained their positions because of Andrew Jackson and other people of power that maybe weren't on the up and up. Jackson was also known for his fight against the National Bank. Jackson, being a common man, he believed that the National Bank was really a large federal government bureaucracy that was stripping normal human or American citizens of their money and really not doing justice to the American economy. Well, he fought against the National Bank. It was a really big point of fighting during his presidency. He was also famous for he stood against the Supreme Court. For example, we talked about Worcester versus Georgia. I told you the Supreme Court said that states weren't allowed and again, it's a lot more than this, but the states weren't allowed to really be the ones who decided what could and couldn't happen regarding the Native Americans' lands, because the Supreme Court said that that was a national issue because the Indian lands were nations to themselves, so that was a federal issue. Well, the Supreme Court decided that. Andrew Jackson really stood up against the Supreme Court at one point, saying, "Let them see if they can enforce these laws. They can say it, but can they enforce it? Can they stop me?" And again, kind of that kingly mannerism. And then he eventually signed the Indian Removal Act. So personally in his life, he had some things that look like he did favor Native Americans sometimes, but then in his presidential decisions, he really did push very hardly and cruelly against Native Americans. All right, country divided. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, with this was northern states opposing slavery, southern states supporting slavery. They decided to make a compromise. You see the yellow state there in the middle of the country in the map there. That's Missouri. And then you see the orange farthest north state in the northeast there. That's Maine. So this compromise, the Missouri Compromise, it's kind of easy to remember what first state they allowed in the country. A compromise was reached that Missouri could join the Union as a slave state. Now, Maine would join as a free state, and this would kind of keep the balance of power in Congress. They also decided they would draw a line below Maine in the lands that were formerly the Louisiana Purchase. You see the blue land there. They would say all the land below Missouri there would join the Union or could eventually join the Union as a slave state. All the land north of that line, that's the 3630 line, by the way, latitude line. All the land north of that line, you see the dark green up there beside Missouri, that would join eventually as a free state. That's what the compromise was. That eventually kind of everything went awry, not within a couple decades, but that's what that compromise was, Missouri Compromise. Nullification crisis. We're going back to Andrew Jackson here. This was when South Carolina threatened to secede over tariffs, otherwise known as taxes. That hurt southern agricultural states more. So these taxes hurt southern agriculture, and South Carolina didn't like it. Jackson, being the president at the time, basically told them, "You're not going to do this. You're not going to nullify these laws." Nullify just means states have the power to say no to federal laws. Well, that really wasn't the case, and Andrew Jackson enforced that. Again, that President King Jackson kind of, he said, "Nope, I don't care if you're a state and you want that power to nullify that law, it's not going to happen." And so he enforced it, saying, "Nope, you're not going to nullify the law, and South Carolina, you're not going to secede from the Union." Again, secede just means leave the country and start your own country, really. South Carolina felt they had the right to. Jackson clearly didn't. He also, and you see that cartoon there, Jackson. So what this did is keep South Carolina from seceding, but eventually, a few decades later, we see that South Carolina got upset again and seceded later, starting the Civil War. So annexation of Texas. We're talking about the country being divided and splitting and growing. Texas in 1845 becomes the 28th state to join the Union. They join the country as a slave state, and this puts more pressure on this hotly debated slave state, free state issue, right? You got a big landmass of Texas joining as a slave state. More and more pressure is building. So now we're a couple decades later, the Compromise of 1850. This really is 5 bills, and included in this, the most notable of these 5 bills of the Compromise of 1850 is the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed the legal capture of escaped slaves who fled to northern freedom to be brought back to southern slaveholders, right? This infuriated northern abolitionists and any northerner for the most part, because they felt like it wasn't the right of Southerners to come up into their state and capture people and drag them back into captivity in the South. Even freedmen, people who weren't slaves but were African Americans, were often taken and captured and kidnapped. And on the words of 1 or 2 slave hunters, were told that they were slaves and were brought back legally. Even the northern states were forced to help them do this. And this really began to split that divide between the North and the South and their views on slavery and state rights and who was in charge and who wasn't. Uncle Tom's Cabin, this was a book written in 1852. It's just a fictional story. It's not even factual. It's not based on a specific true story, but it's written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a white woman who was and abolitionists, and it denounced the terrors of slavery. And it really increased the fortitude of abolitionists. And by that, I just mean that this fictional book captivated America. It was a best-selling book, selling millions, not just in our country, but around the world even. And because of the fictional yet real story, it was fictional, but it really told a lot of the true facts of what was happening in slavery in the South. It really sparked the emotions and showed the realities of slavery to many Northerners and people around the world. And it really caused them to be more strongly opposed to slavery. Let's talk about a little bit later the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is in 1854, and it allowed for popular sovereignty in these newly formed territories, leading to bleeding Kansas with violent clashes between pro and anti-slavery protesters. Popular sovereignty. That just means that a decision was made in Congress to say that these new or potentially new states, Kansas and Nebraska specifically, the policy of popular sovereignty was in place there, which meant the people in those states or territories, technically, they would vote whether or not they would choose to be a free state or slave state. Only white men could vote, by the way. So no blacks could vote in this popular sovereignty. So it kind of made sense, kind of like saying, okay, well, let the states decide if they want to be free or slave. But the problem was, besides the obvious black-white issue as far as who got to vote, the problem was that you have a lot of strong abolitionists moving from the north into Kansas because they said, we're going to be there so we can up the vote for abolition, for this state being a free state. And a lot of Southerners who were strong believers in slavery were moving to Kansas so they could increase the vote, the popular vote, for slavery. And now you have this clash of these strong abolitionists and strong slavery people who were fighting in Kansas. And it really was a bloody battle, battles and fights that took place in Kansas. And some people even say that in a lot of ways was kind of the prelude or the initial start of a civil war. It wasn't technically the start of the Civil War, but it really was kind of a miniature civil war in the state of Kansas, and that's popular sovereignty. So the Dred Scott case, otherwise known as, and rightly known as, Scott versus Sanford. That's the Supreme Court case where Justice Roger Taney, we don't like Roger Taney, I hope not anyway, he was probably one of the worst Supreme Court justices, if for no other reason than this ruling here. He ruled that blacks had no rights in our country because they were simply property. They weren't U.S. citizens. They were property of U.S. citizens. This understandably really upset the blacks and the abolitionists alike, who all felt like this was an injustice to slaves and African Americans in this country. So the Dred Scott case, I tell you to remember it this way. It would be dreadful to be Dred Scott, because in the Dred Scott or the Scott versus Sanford case, it was just deeply established in American legal system that slaves were not people like the rest of the American citizens, and they shouldn't be treated like American citizens. All right, so let's move on. Industrialization played as great of a divisive role as anything when it comes to slavery, and let's talk about why. So the northern states, their population grew rapidly due to the growth of mills, industry, and factories. So cities began to grow. Populations became more dense in these cities. Production increased with factories, and costs were driven lower because you could produce more at cheaper costs. There was an abundance of cheap labor. A lot of that labor was immigrant labor. A lot of Irish were coming over during the early and mid part of the 1800s. Also Italians, and Italians were later, but you had the Germans coming over also. And this provided an alternative to slavery in these industrial sectors. And so you had a lot of cheap labor. Now, so that's what was going on in the north. Now, in the south, you have a lot less dense population. You have large plantations and farmland. And wealth was there, but only held by a few. And this was created because of cash crops, mostly because of cotton. And there was a strong demand for slaves to work on these cash crop plantations to help pick and produce the cotton and other goods as well, tobacco. Even northern industry relied on these cash crop industries that were slave held because the cotton was usually shipped raw up to the northern industry states where that cotton was put through textile mills and came out as cloth and fabric. So it was kind of a two-way street here. Now, inventions like the cotton gin, as I said before, greatly incentivized slavery because it made it more profitable for the plantation owners to have more slaves at this point. And then you have the western lands. This is where mining and agriculture was very common. These new lands were a place of Chinese immigration, but other areas also became a battleground for anti-slavery versus slavery, just like I talked about Kansas and Nebraska, you have Missouri. So this industry began to separate the haves from the have-nots. It separated new ways of thinking and new economies from old traditional ways of thinking and traditional economies in the South. And so the divide wasn't just slavery, it was a way of life and a way of thinking and a way of modernization that were really shifting and separating the North from the South, leading us to the Civil War. So before we get there, I got one slide ahead. Abraham Lincoln and South Carolina. So Lincoln was a Northerner. He was from Illinois. He was outspoken against slavery, but he wasn't technically an abolitionist in that, at least not at first, in that he wasn't trying, his main purpose wasn't to abolish slavery. It was to keep slavery from growing. His main goal as he became elected as president was to really keep the country united. And he says that plenty of times. His goal was to unite the country, not to necessarily abolish slavery. And so when he became elected president, he was a Republican. Southern states, 9 of the southern states didn't cast a single vote for Abraham Lincoln. This was 2 reasons. 1, because the vast majority of the voting population in the South would not have voted for him. But 2, was because his name wasn't even on the ballot. They couldn't vote for him. They wouldn't have anyway, but they couldn't. So that's how divided our country was. There was enough votes in the North to vote for him as president, and they didn't even vote a single vote in much of the South for him. So in 1860, in protest to the Republican Lincoln winning the presidency, South Carolina secedes from the Union, meaning they leave the country, right? Many other states soon follow. And that was even before he stepped into office. He got voted and elected as president, and before his inauguration, they were already left from the country. So that was before he even technically became president. And then in April 12th, 1861, there's an attack on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Confederates attack a Union-held fort, Fort Sumter, which all these Confederates were Union themselves just a few short weeks or months earlier. But they attacked this fort basically saying, get these American or these United States troops out of our land. And they eventually overthrow the fort, and this becomes the first battle of the Civil War. So Fort Sumter, the first battle of the Civil War. All right. So now we have a splitting of the country from 1 nation to 2. You have the Union states, which were simply all the United States that didn't secede from the Union. That's a Union state because the southern states, before they seceded, they were Union states as well. It was Union, the United States, right? Well, the Union states were all of the United States that did not secede. These were the northern states led by President Abraham Lincoln, right? And then the Confederate states are the states that do secede, that do say we're leaving the country. These states you see on the map there are the purple states, and they didn't all secede at once, but eventually this is what we had when we had the Southern Confederate States. They were the states that seceded from the Union, and they elected and they chose Jefferson Davis to be the president of their new nation. Let's talk about some advantages and disadvantages. The Union country, the Union Army, the Union nation, the United States, this was a large, much larger population. If you look at the map, you see it's the northern states. I told you before, lots of cities, a lot more dense population. So they had a lot more people and therefore a lot more soldiers. They had more railroads, more industry, so they had ability to transport goods and soldiers much easier. They had a better government and a stronger, more established government because, you know, they were the United States. They weren't a brand new nation like the Confederacy. They had a stronger economic system, at least once they split, because they had industry and they had established currency. And then the couple things that they weren't as they didn't have as advantages over the South was they had worse military commanders than many of the Southern leaders. The Union really struggled with strategy and tacticians of their Union commanders, especially early in the war. And then oftentimes, because much of the battles of the Civil War was fought in the South and not in the North, They just didn't have the knowledge of the land like the Southerners did. If the battles are fought in your home state or your home territory, you know the land. If you're fighting on somebody else's land, you don't know the land like they do. So that was a disadvantage of the Union. Now the Confederates, they had a smaller population, so they had less soldiers. They had a weaker government. They didn't want a strong federal government in their Confederate states because that's what they're fighting against in some regard. And they had a brand new government, so they had a weaker government. They didn't really have much of an economy in terms of they didn't have a currency. They didn't have an economic system in place. The South relied on plantation and crops. And the North eventually did a lot of use the Navy to blockade a lot of the shipments of cotton. They were trying to ship it to Europe and make money that way, and the Union really put a stop to that in a lot of ways. So they had almost no industry in the South. The South was a cash crop plantation economy. So they had no industry or very little industry, and so they didn't have a very good system for making weapons of warfare, for making items and clothing needed to produce a capable army, right? They had a large slave population, which, as you can imagine, a slave population is not going to be helpful to the Confederate Army. They're going to be resistant, if anything. But some of their advantages were they did have better military leaders. Robert E. Lee probably being chief of that. He was and many others, but Robert E. Lee was their commanding general of the Army, and he was a brilliant military tactician for most of the war, for most of the battles, as were many of the other Confederate generals. And again, this was kind of a disadvantage because you don't want battles fought in your home state. But since they did have an advantage because they were knowledgeable of the territory. So that's the Union and the Confederates. Again, remember the Union is the Northern Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, Free State, United States. The South is the Confederate, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, slave states. All right, so let's talk about those two men. Ulysses S. Grant, he eventually, not initially, but eventually becomes the Union General-in-Chief he's the commanding officer of the Union or U.S. forces after many failures by previous generals. Robert E. Lee is the Confederate general throughout the war, and he's renowned for his ability to lead. Grant eventually becomes a pretty successful and good leader of his military, but it takes a while before they get to him. Battle of Antietam. We could spend hours talking about the Civil War, but we're going to focus it down to just what we need for the Star, what we've seen on the Star before. The Battle of Antietam was a Union victory that led to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln finally decided that I'm going to set the slaves free. He's going to proclaim their emancipation. That's declaring that all slaves in Confederate states were free. Now, as you can imagine, because it's in the middle of the war, the Confederate states didn't tell their slaves, oh, Abraham Lincoln emancipated you, now you can go free. So they didn't really free many slaves, but it did oftentimes give them hope and helped freed African Americans in the northern states have a purpose to fight in this war. So the Emancipation Proclamation after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln freeing the slaves. Again, they weren't quite free yet. A couple of the battles, the siege of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was a city on the Mississippi River, and it was an essential point for the Southern Army, the Confederate Army, because as long as they held Vicksburg, which was a very well-fortified city, then the Union couldn't take the entire Mississippi River, which was an important point of transportation, as you can imagine, for the Confederate soldiers. Here's what we see on the test a few different times, at least. The siege of Vicksburg, the Union eventually defeats the Confederates and they take the city of Vicksburg. What we see on the test is that and it is true, the importance of taking that city, among other things, was that it really split the Confederate forces in half. Now all the Confederate forces west of the Mississippi are divided by the Mississippi River, which is now held by the Union forces, and all the ones east are divided from the west. Appomattox Courthouse. This is the site where Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate Army to Ulysses S. Grant, and his Union forces essentially this ended the war. This is where Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Grant. That's at Appomattox Courthouse. All right, so the Civil War essentially comes to an end at Appomattox, as I said. Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant. This is April 9th, 1865. A few short days later, right after the war really ends, Abraham Lincoln, he is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. This proved to be a pretty terrible blow for the Confederate States because Lincoln, he really wanted a lenient expedient, a quick reuniting of the states. He didn't want a long, arduous, military-occupied South. What he wanted was a quick uniting of the states to be one country again. But because he was assassinated, you have a different man, Andrew Johnson, becomes president after Lincoln dies. And now you have the radical Republicans. Radical Republicans are congressmen who are strong abolitionists. They were strongly against slavery. They fought for civil rights for former slaves. They felt the southern states deserved a harsh treatment for their role in slavery and the war. Abolitionists are an interesting crew at the time. They are, or the radical Republicans. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, but he was a much more conservative Republican. The radical Republicans were the men in Congress, exclusively Northerners, who really, really wanted rights and abolition and freedom and opportunities for former slaves. And they really supported a lot of the Freedmen's Bureau and civil rights movements of the slaves, or the former slaves, the freedmen in the South. So let's talk about the Reconstruction that takes place. So Reconstruction is just the idea that we're reconstructing our country. We're putting it back together again, right? The South and the North starting to combine to become a single country once again. So you have presidential Reconstruction and congressional Reconstruction. It's all the same thing, except it's very different ways of going about the same thing. Presidential Reconstruction is what we call the period of time immediately after the Civil War. Andrew Johnson, who was the vice president under Lincoln, he's actually a Southerner, interestingly enough, but he's different than many Southerners, but he's a lot more lenient to the Southern cause than most people would have expected a man to be who was the vice president of Abraham Lincoln. So he was, like I said, sympathetic to former Confederate states. He resisted the radical Republicans. He was very different. And he often resisted the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a federal organization to help blacks and to help them become successful citizens in our country and actually keep them alive, because they were really, when they were set free with the 13th Amendment, these African Americans had no homes, had no jobs. Many of them were illiterate. They didn't have successful careers and opportunities for careers, especially in the South. It was a very trying time. And Andrew Johnson really wasn't helpful to the slave or to the African American cause. He really wanted to reunite the nations, but he didn't really want to punish the South, and he didn't really seem to seek very hard to help the African Americans during Reconstruction. Well, then we go to the Congressional Reconstruction. This is the time where Congress begins to take over. Radical Republicans in Congress begin to overthrow Johnson, eventually splitting the South into 5 military districts. So all these southern states are split up into 5 military districts. They required the states to ratify the 14th Amendment, which was an amendment that Congress passed that provided equal protection under the law for all former slaves, so they couldn't be mistreated. Under this radical Reconstruction, blacks started to vote. You can see that picture on the bottom right. Blacks began to hold political offices because blacks were voting. And many were elected to really prestigious and important political offices throughout the South. But this didn't really last very long, unfortunately. So let's talk about some of the Reconstruction amendments. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery in the United States. It really made official what the Emancipation Proclamation was trying to do. The 13th Amendment was an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Slaves are now free. No slavery in our country ever again. 14th Amendment. It granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., and this is the important part, it guaranteed equal protection under the laws. 15th Amendment. This is the one that gave blacks, specifically only black men, because not even white women or black women were allowed to vote at this time, but it gave blacks the right to vote. They shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. That would mean previously being a slave. They shall not be denied an ability to vote. Many southern states, however, had laws that restricted blacks' ability to vote. Things like literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all of these things that were the southern way to try to restrict black opportunities in the South. Let's talk more about that, unfortunately. Black codes. They were overtly racist and restrictive laws against former slaves imposed within many former Confederate states, southern states, immediately after the Civil War. So black codes were really racist laws that really, you can see this picture is kind of an illustration of it. that did everything they could to keep the whites in power and the blacks restricted. Things as simple as where you could live, what jobs you could have, who you could work for, even going out in public, um, where you could eat, where you could buy or sell anything, or if you could buy or sell anything, even being able to go to certain churches or even form your own churches was restricted in a lot of these black codes. It basically found a legal loophole for them to force them to be kind of a modern version of slavery. They had a lot of the same, the whites had a lot of the same power that they did before slavery was ended. It's pretty terrible what the black codes were. The Freedmen's Bureau, this was a federal government organization that was formed in 1865, so right at the end of the Civil War. And they worked to provide food, shelter, clothing, schools, employment opportunities, and organizations and social structure for former slaves. And let's talk about why that's needed, because slavery, they lived on plantations. They lived not in good homes generally. They were in shanties and shacks on plantation farms and stuff. Some lived in the home, but usually behind or out back. And these slaves, oftentimes it was illegal to teach them how to read. A lot of them didn't know how to read, and they didn't have no careers or the marketplace or a lot of social norms, because they were treated like workhorses and like work animals on a farm, and many of them never left that. So they had very little social abilities because they didn't have opportunities. And this is not for all of them, but many of them just were so discriminated against during slavery that after slavery ended, now they no longer had homes. They didn't have job opportunities apart from oftentimes just working in the same fields for the same farmer that they were a slave to beforehand. And they didn't have, like I said, they didn't have educational opportunities. They just, social structures and norms were just not in place for them. It was a very unfair society. And so the Freedmen's Bureau came along to try to give opportunities, to give kind of a stepping stones to allow them to infiltrate society and have opportunities in the South. All right, forming a U.S. government. So let's see here. I think this is the one. Okay, yeah. Forming a U.S. government. So we're not really going in a linear pattern here. We're going. We're just going to talk about government in general. Okay. So here we go. Declaration of Independence. This is just the high points. Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, and it proclaimed the colonies were forming their own nation. We know that. It complained about the king, and it said, we're starting it and doing it our way. Now, the Articles of Confederation, that was the first foundational government law of the U.S. It was a really weak central/federal government and a very strong state government. There was no president or judicial system in the Articles of Confederation. It really wasn't a very successful government or governmental structure. So in 1787, just a few years after the failure of the Articles of Confederation, we have the Constitutional Convention. That's where delegates from the different states come together. They convene to form a constitution. That's where they write the U.S. Constitution and restructure the U.S. government. And there's two real groups in this Constitutional Convention. You have the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. The Federalists are those in favor of a strong federal or central government, and they wanted, they were really in favor of this Constitution. These were men like Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and James Madison. Then you have the Anti-Federalists. Those are the men who were against a strong federal government, anti-federal government. And it wasn't that they were against a completely strong central government, but they were more in favor of a strong state rights and specifically also personal freedoms and rights. These were men like George Mason and Patrick Henry. Let's talk about that U.S. Constitution that they finally ratified. It's the foundational law of the land for the U.S. It's written by James Madison. It created three branches of the federal government. Those three branches are the executive branch, which is the president and the cabinet and the vice president. And then you have the legislative branch, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate. That's the Congress, basically. And then you have the judicial branch, right? That's the judges, the federal court system, and the Supreme Court. Those are the three branches of government, and they're meant to check and balance each other. You have the Bill of Rights. These are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They strongly supported by anti-federalists who wanted these personal rights. Those are the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. They give rights to people, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Those are the parts of the First Amendment. Great Compromise. This is also known as the Connecticut Compromise. It's a decision to split the legislative body or Congress into two parts. As we've said, the bicameral, two parts, right? House of Representatives. Each state has representatives based on their population. Makes sense. And then the Senate. Each state is equally represented, 2 representatives for each state. All right, during this constitutional convention, you also have what's known as the 3/5 compromise. It's a decision to count only 3/5 of each state towards population numbers in terms of slaveholding states in regards to the House of Representatives, in terms of population representation. So this didn't allow slave states to have as many representatives in the House, but they actually, you could also say they kind of had they got to count slaves as part of their population, but not fully. So it is what it is. George Washington elected as the first president of the U.S. with John Adams as his vice president. Washington selects Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. Hamilton was more in favor of a strong federal government. He was in favor of a national bank. Jefferson was more agrarian focused, and he believed more that the United States needed to be a bunch of small farmers, while Alexander Hamilton was more about industry and cities. And they kind of really were the leaders of what eventually became political parties, really. Washington, when he stepped down from his presidency after 2 terms, 4-year terms, he said this in his farewell address. He said, he had a really long farewell address, but one of the things he said is, don't split the country by forming political parties. Jefferson and Hamilton. That didn't really work out. And he also said, don't join in long-term alliances with other nations. Well, that didn't really happen either. Okay, let's talk about the courtroom, the judicial branch. That's the federal form of judges and court that was formed with the Constitution, one of the 3 branches. By the way, the Articles of Confederation didn't have a judicial branch. Each state and community, like town or county, might have had their own way of having judges and court process. But in the Articles of Confederation, that didn't even exist. So the judicial branch is significant in the Constitution. Let's talk about 3 cases that we often see on STAAR tests. The Marbury versus Madison case. This was presided over by John Marshall. He was a Supreme Court justice. And the Supreme Court in this Marbury versus Madison, you can think of all 3 of these M's, right? Marbury, Madison is the court case. One of the justices is John Marshall. This established the principle of judicial review. Judicial review just means that the judges in the federal court are the ones who decide if a law matches up with the Constitution, the constitutionality of a law. They can decide, oh, that law shouldn't apply because that law needs to be done away with. It's not constitutional. And that's what established this idea with Marbury versus Madison. Now you have Scott v. Sanford. That's the Dred Scott case. Remember, it's dreadful to be Dred Scott because he was a slave suing for his rightful freedom. But thanks to the Supreme Court and Roger Taney, they said that slaves weren't citizens at all. Slaves had no rights. Slaves were merely property. And property doesn't have rights over citizens. Again, a dreadful case, right? Scott v. Sanford, Dred Scott. Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia didn't have the right to regulate Native American lands. Well, Andrew Jackson, he disagreed with this. He was the president at the time, and he just said, oh, the Supreme Court ruling, I don't care. And he ended up going, he said sarcastically, now let him enforce it, talking about the Supreme Court. He just said, I'd like to see them try to enforce this law because I don't care what they say. All right, let's move on to being a citizen. So civic duties versus civic responsibilities. Civic duties, those are the required obligations of American citizens. That's your duty. You're required to obey the laws. You're required to pay taxes. You're required to serve on jury duty when called upon. And you're required to witness in a court case if you're called upon. Now, civic responsibilities are a little different. They are more optional works of American citizens. These are things like registering to vote. You don't have to do that. And voting. You do not have to vote. You have the opportunity to vote. Things like running for political office or participating in community activities or whatnot. Those are responsibilities. Yes, it's your responsibility, but it's not your duty. You don't have to do it. Military service can fall in either category depending on the subtext. So like you could say it's your civic responsibility to serve in the military, but you don't have to. Unless you're drafted, then it becomes a civic duty, right? Okay, so U.S. citizenship. You're a U.S. citizen if you're born in the United States. You're a U.S. citizen if your parents are both U.S. citizens. And then you can become a naturalized U.S. citizen, which means that you are made after you're born into a U.S. citizen. That's called the naturalization process. So you must pass a citizenship test, and that can include a language test, a civics test, which asks you about U.S. government and history, and then a lengthy interview, and then you have to say a oath of allegiance to our country. That's how you become a naturalized citizen. So that's citizenship. All right, immigration. Let's talk about that a little bit. You have Irish immigrants, German immigrants, and Chinese immigrants. You have more immigrants during this part of American history, but these are the three that we focus on at this point. Irish immigrants between 1820 and 1860. Almost 2 million arrived in the U.S., mostly after the Great Potato Famine in Ireland. Many settled in the Northeast and often lived in cities and worked in factories. German immigrants between 1820 and 1870, nearly 8 million arrived in the U.S. Some of the things that they introduced to our culture were things like kindergartens, Christmas trees, hamburgers and hot dogs. These things that we consider truly American, well, they really were from the German immigrants. Chinese immigrants. Often the German immigrants worked in cities and factories, but oftentimes they lived in the Midwest states where they worked on small farms. Chinese immigrants. They arrived in the western United States as early as the 1820s. Most arrived in the 1849 gold rush era or shortly thereafter. Many of them came, like a lot of Americans and other immigrants, from the East. The Chinese came from the West, and they arrived in California. A lot of people came there to get rich, trying to find gold, right? Well, some of them worked in gold and mining, but many of them ended up working on the railroads, specifically the Transcontinental Railroad. A lot of Chinese immigrants worked there. You can see that image there of what they felt like it was really like for a lot of the Chinese immigrants working on the Transcontinental Railroad. There wasn't nearly as many Chinese immigrants. There was less than 500,000. A lot of immigrants faced what was called nativism. Nativism is a form of racism, often towards immigrants. Irish and German faced nativism, but Chinese faced it probably worse because just because of the nature of where they came, when they came, and I think probably the physical difference caused a lot of the nativism as well in their racism towards the Chinese. It's ironic about nativism because it's really a racism against people who were just like the people being racist against them. Most of the Americans were first, second, or third generation immigrants themselves, and now with nativism, they were being racist against people who were immigrants. Another sad part of American history. So let's talk about women in American society. Women played a key role in early American temperance movement. Temperance was just the social movement against the consumption of alcohol. They didn't want people drinking alcohol, right? We see this throughout American history at different times and places. This was really, in a lot of ways, women's first real social movement in our country was during the temperance movement. This push against alcohol and the consumption of alcohol. And this really led women to participate a lot more in social issues and policy issues in our country. It was really the beginning of a long run of women's civil movements. Women often worked from home in meal preparation, cleaning, garment mending, sustenance farming, raising of livestock, etc. They weren't as involved, they weren't nearly as involved in politics, political issues, civil issues, military issues, but there are some exceptions. And a lot of this was limitations of perception and the nature of lifestyle at the time. Now, with industrialization came opportunities outside of the home for women, really kind of for the first time in a lot of ways. They often found jobs in textile mills and similar industrialization jobs. So they were working in textile mills a lot of times, and this was really what began to change the American workforce, essentially. Slowly but surely was industrialization. Let's talk about some notable women that you might see on the STAAR test. There are others, of course, but it's just not a topic that you see greatly emphasized on the STAAR test, so we're going to kind of limit it. Molly Pitcher, she was a woman who served water That's the name Pitcher. That wasn't her real last name, by the way. That's what they called her, that Molly Pitcher. She served water to soldiers during the Revolutionary War, which seems like a small matter, but as you can imagine, being on a battlefield fighting for a full day or half a day or 20 hours straight, you can imagine that was a crucial role to keeping soldiers alive and fighting. But the story goes that when her husband died, and you see in the painting there's a man laying on the ground. You can barely make him out next to her feet. When her husband died at the helm of a cannon, she took his place and started helping fire the cannon herself, and she was very famous for that. You have Abigail Adams. She was the influential wife of the second president of our country, John Adams, the first vice president, second president. And then you have Harriet Tubman. She was an escaped slave herself, and she was the leader or the conductor of this Underground Railroad. She went back into slave-held Confederate, or not Confederate states, but she went into slave-held territory in the South many, many, many times, risking her life to help other slaves escape to freedom in the North. Then you have Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was the white woman who was an abolitionist author of the fictional book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were women's suffrage proponents. So women's suffrage, we don't see a whole lot of headway in that in this part of U.S. history, but they were really the early proponents of it. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they really were pushing for the woman's right to vote. And they were some of the first to really make this push. That's what suffrage means, is the right to vote, by the way. Okay, the arts. Hudson River School is an art movement of painters and paintings of natural landscapes. And the way to remember this is river. Think of rivers are natural. There's a couple examples of beautiful paintings there that are very vibrant, colorful, and just show immense, vast natural landscapes, right? The Hudson River School is not a school, so don't be confused. It's a movement of art and artists in the mid and late 1800s. These artists were inspired by the American natural landscape. And if you think about it, there was a big push of Manifest Destiny, moving out west, seeing these wide open, expansive lands, and this played a big part in it. So transcendentalism, we've only seen this, I think, on 1 or 2 tests. It's not very common, but it's this idyllic belief system emerging in the 1820s, and it held that divinity transcends throughout nature. So there has a lot of common with the Hudson River School movement, too. Some of the writers included in this, 2 of the most prominent ones are probably Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. We're not going to go into a lot of the detail on it because I'm not sure that you'll see it, but if you can recognize those names with the Transcendentalism movement, you should be good. And then here's some other notable writers. Some we've already mentioned. Harriet Beecher Stowe again, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Walt Whitman, he was an influential poet and author. Edgar Allan Poe, he was known for his mysterious poems. And then you have Frederick Douglass. He was a former slave, very eloquent orator or public speaker. He was an abolitionist and a writer as well. And then Thomas Jefferson, probably the most famous American writer, if for no other reason than he wrote the Declaration of Independence. We need to remember that. It's always on the STAAR test. The working men, women, and children. Most early settlers farmed, fished, hunted, traded, did everything necessary to survive. As cities began to form and civilization began to grow, work changed, however. So the northern states, there was forests, natural harbors, fast-flowing rivers, and then cities began to form. Shipbuilding was a common industry, timber industry, fishing, textile mills, which is just cloth. Merchants in these cities, eventually factories, women and children worked in these factories too once industrialization began to take off. So the southern states, they're warmer, there's a longer growing season, there's fertile soil. Agriculture and cash crops like tobacco, cotton, and rice were grown on plantations, and slavery was used to grow these cash crops. The western states and territories were large, wide open areas. They were isolated from the rest of the eastern states and colonies and territories, and they were more often mountainous, and mining and agriculture was very common. Mining because the gold rush and then later the silver discoveries as well. Railroads made it out to the west. You remember the transcontinental, and then Manifest Destiny played a big role in the west, of course. During early industrialization, more people moved to northern cities to find work in factories, and these conditions were often dangerous. Immigrants moved in. And there was a congestion of people living in these cities, very dense, very dirty, very dangerous because there's a lot of poverty. And there were so many immigrants and so many people moving to these cities that work was really cheap and it was hard to survive for a lot of people. Many women and children even worked in these dangerous textile mills. Children were often employed because they had smaller hands and they could reach into the nooks and crannies of these really elaborate machines, and oftentimes were injured in doing so. After many years of mounting deaths, protests, strikes, led to eventually the formation of unions and gradual legislation for better and safer work conditions. But this didn't happen until many years after it all started. Not really a big issue or topic really in a lot of our history that we're studying quite yet. So we're going to go through the maps and the geography real briefly here, okay? Don't be confused about these original 13 colonies, because there were some original colonies before that. You got Plymouth and Jamestown, but they merged or formed with other colonies. There was 13 original colonies. You see those in the dark pink on the right side. I want your focus to be on the maps, not on the words right now. Listen to what I'm saying and be looking at the maps. Just get a feel for where things are. These are the New England colonies. You can see the map insert to see where they are in relation to the rest of the country. New England colonies are the northern eastern colonies. Then you have the middle colonies. Those are the middle eastern colonies. Pretty far north, actually, but they're not as far north as the New England for the most part. Then you have the southern colonies. These are the broadest range of colonies, going from Georgia all the way up to Maryland. Let's see some geography facts here. You have the Appalachian Mountains in green on the map. Again, be looking at the map there. They run north and south across the western edge of most of the original colonies, right? Remember the proclamation line of 1763, the King of England said, okay, the French and Indian War is over. I don't want any more of my colonists going past these mountains. I proclaimed this line here in 1763. Don't go west of that anymore. West of that was the Ohio River Valley. That's the blue area where the French and Indian War was fought. That's where the British finally gained that land from the French, acquired it after winning the French and Indian War. I already talked about the proclamation line of 1763. Let's look at the bottom right-hand side of your map, the Indian Removal Act. This area in purple is where many of the Indians who were removed from their land in the Trail of Tears journey, they left this area and moved over to where the arrow ends, that land right above Texas, we know it. It was called the Oklahoma Territory. Transcontinental Railroad. The red and blue lines mark where the Union Pacific, which is the red, and the blue, which is the Central Pacific, two different railroad lines where they connected and met in the middle, and that's called the Transatlantic Railroad, right? It goes from the western part of the United States, and it finally connects to that eastern part. You see, it looks like the line just ends in the middle of the country, right? Well, there's tons and tons and thousands of miles of railroad in the eastern part of the country, and this finally connected to them. They're just not on the map. There were numerous railroads in the east, but this connected finally the country to the west, like I said. The National Road, we've seen it on a couple tests. It's in the far northeast. It's early in our country's history, 1811 to 1837. 620 miles cutting across the part of the Appalachians. And it connects the eastern part of the U.S. to, at the time, what was the western part of our country at the time. It's also called the Cumberland Road, the National Road. It was the first road funded by federal funds, like money from the federal government, and it was a big movement in our country. But maybe bigger and more important than that was the Erie Canal. It was 360 miles connecting Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes in the Midwest, to the Hudson River, which went down to New York City. This really grew the city of New York because now you could transport goods very quickly, very easily from the Midwest if you got to the Erie Canal, which is a canal, by the way, is just a man-made river. They carved the land out, yes, by hand. They carved the land out, creating a river, connecting the Hudson River. It's pretty fascinating if you think about the time period and the technology they did not have, and still they were able to do this. It cut costs of transportation by as much as 95%. So basic regions and features, you got the Rocky Mountains in green there. You got the Great Plains in the middle of the United States. You got the Mississippi River running at the edge of the Midwest there, running north and south all the way to Louisiana in the south, Mississippi in the north. You got the Appalachian Mountains, which we've talked a lot about. And then the upper right, you've got the Manifest Destiny map. And I just want you to remember, look at this map, Manifest Destiny. We want to get it all. We're going from coast to coast, right? And then it separates the country into regions too. And when you hear about the Southwest, that's usually what it's talking about right there. When you hear about the Southeast, the green is what it's talking about, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. Just want you to get a feel for that. Here's some battles of the American Revolution. Again, that's rarely anything like that quite on a test. I just wanted you to see it. Press pause if you want to look at that. The Civil War, the purple is the Confederate Southern slaveholding states. The blue is the Northern Union states, most of which were free states. And then you've got the territories. This is during the time of the Civil War. And some of those blue states on the west weren't actually states at the beginning of the war, but they joined as states during the war. Here's the Civil War battles map. Again, not probably going to need to see that, know where all these are at or anything, so don't worry about that. But you can press pause if you want to look at that for a moment. And then our last map, which also happens to be our last slide. The video's almost over. You're welcome. Let's look at this a little bit more closely. So the land, let's start on the east coast on the far right of your map. The brown area, that's the territory of the original 13 states after the Treaty of 1783, when we gained the land that in the Treaty of 1783, ending the Revolutionary War, when Great Britain said, fine, you can have the land, you can have your freedom, you are independent, we are no longer the boss of you, so to speak. Right? So all of that brown area or that light brown area is the area that the United States gained. Now, were those all split up into states? No, just the easternmost portion of those were split up into states. And so all the area in the middle part of that brown, or on the west part of that brown, that was the Ohio River Valley, which were not states yet. Those were territories. And actually, they decided what to do with those with what they called the Northwest Ordinance. But you see areas like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and Illinois, yeah, that was northwest to them, because all of the rest of the country to the left of that, to the west of the Mississippi River, well, that wasn't part of the United States territory. So that was the Northwest. So the Northwest Ordinance decided how to rule those territories and how those territories could eventually become states. So all of that brown area was the original United States, the 13 original colonies on the East Coast, and then the territories in the middle there. So then, shortly after we become a country, second president, Thomas Jefferson, buys the Louisiana Purchase. Don't get confused. Louisiana Purchase isn't that tiny little state of Louisiana just down there. Louisiana Purchase is all of that white dotted land. So you can see why it was so important. See how big it made our country? It almost doubled the size of our country. The eastern edge of it was the Mississippi. So you see where the brown and the white converge there on the map? That's the Mississippi River. That's why that line is so weird and squiggly. It's because that's the weird and squiggly Mississippi River line. So all the white land, that's the Louisiana Purchase land, okay? Now, that river that goes up where you see the British Cession of 1818, that's really never been a STAAR test question, so don't worry about that so much. But that line that goes up there, that's not really the Mississippi. That's part of the Missouri River. But nonetheless, that's the river that Thomas Jefferson sent. Their names are, I can't think of their names right now. It'll come to me. But sent a crew of people out to explore the Louisiana Purchase and the western part of our country. Again, always be thinking about manifest destiny. Our country's always trying to grow, right? And so now you see Texas annexation in the blue. That's where Texas joined the country. Again, Texas wasn't even the same shape. Eventually, when Texas becomes a state, it becomes the state that we know today. But that's Texas annexation, when it joined the United States. Now you have the pink land west of that, when the United States went to war with Mexico, started with the Battle of Palo Alto. When we went to war with Mexico and we won that war, Mexico ceded, the Mexican Cession is what it's called. They gave that land to the United States as part of an agreement to end the war. So the United States gained California, Nevada, most of Arizona, parts of New Mexico and Colorado, all of Utah, and even parts of Wyoming there. So there's a big chunk of land the United States gained from Mexico, right? More growth of the country, more manifest destiny. And right before that happened, actually, you have the Oregon Territory, which the United States agreed to. There was no war fought. There was just an agreement with Great Britain. Great Britain could have the lands north of that dotted line in present-day Canada, and the bright yellow areas with the United States gained, the Oregon Territory. Then you have the Gadsden Purchase. not long after the Mexican cession, where the United States bought land from Mexico there in the kind of the orange below the pink. All right, so that's the maps, that's the history, that's the end. We're at an hour and about almost 5 minutes. I know it was a long video. That's probably the last one you're going to be watching before you start the STAAR test. Go back and watch some others if you have some issues with any. Just be studying your STAAR packet, your STAAR study guide packet. If you do that, if you've watched all these videos as you're supposed to and gone through them and paid attention, and you continue studying your packet, you're going to be in great shape come time for this STAAR test.